So, Douglas, thank you very much. It's exciting to have those bookends of the very beginning and end, and I hope that folks will be engaged by the rest of the book and reading it. One of the things, I guess, where I'm interested to start is that very recently there's been quite a bit of the writing that you've been doing, including a talk yesterday at U of H, has engaged notions of dance. Mm-hmm. And certainly I think there are kind of precedents that exist in that. One of the things that you talk about in the book also was some early work with Joan Jonas, including the performances and the film Song Delay. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about how you've seen that kind of progression of interdisciplinary work, or what we might now call interdisciplinary work, from the time that you arrived in New York. And specifically thinking about how the kind of terms that get initiated back then are important for us now, and if those notions have changed for you also.
In this period, the period that the book covers, I was a naive kid, let's say, and I had just come from college, and I had no background in contemporary art. One could not study it in those days. I was lucky in many ways, as I describe in the event of my getting the job at the Guggenheim. I was lucky in the people that I worked with at the Guggenheim, including Linda Shearer, who was my colleague as a curatorial assistant. I was lucky in the curator that I worked for, Diane Waldman, and especially I think Diane's friend Betsy Baker, who became my editor. She was the managing editor at Art News, and she commissioned my first piece of writing. But I had very little sense of contemporary art when I first arrived. I learned it quickly through my job at the Guggenheim. And so on the one hand, I think, my sense of the contemporary when I was in college and before I came to New York was abstract expressionism. It was that, it was really a former style. I knew the work, for example, of Jack Goldstein, who became a friend. His daughters were both friends of mine. So it took me quite a long time, actually, to absorb what was happening during that time, and even a little bit earlier, which was the replacement, essentially, of painting and sculpture by new forms that were then being invented by artists, such as performance, video, installation work, conceptual art, eventually what became institutional critique, as in the work of Daniel Buren. So that happened all in a very short space of time. I mean, imagine, for example, I arrived in '67, I started working at the Guggenheim in '68. It was in '71 already that the international exhibition was devoted to the work from minimal to conceptual art, essentially, and institutional critique. I was pretty much grappling with issues of painting in the first 3-4 years that I was writing. But as I talk about in one chapter of this book, I think I had a kind of transformative experience in seeing performance work. As early as '71, actually, because I remember seeing and write about seeing Joan Jonas's Choreomania, which was one of her early indoors pieces in 1971. Mm-hmm. So I think all of those things were happening at once. I was seeing things like Robert Morris's Castelli Warehouse show with Richard Serra's Splashed Lead in the corner, but at the same time, seeing the late work of the last works of Rothko, for example. And so it was a very wide range of material. I didn't really, I think, come to a realization of how radically different the kind of work that was being made in the '70s around me was to the work that I thought that I knew when I first came to New York. So I was absorbing that all very quickly. I didn't write, the first thing I wrote about performance was an essay on Joan Jonas's performance work in 1976 for a special issue on performance by Studio International. Before that, I had written pretty much exclusively about painting, although as a reviewer, I wrote about many different kinds of things. At the same time, I was seeing artists' films, which were then fairly constantly being shown. I remember particularly Richard Serra's Railroad Turn Bridge, and as you mentioned, Joan Jonas's Song Delay. But you know, I didn't come to dance until very recently. I didn't come to writing about dance until very recently. I saw Cunningham in '70 and was very excited by it, but I certainly had no idea of writing about it. And then I had this kind of immersion in the work of George Balanchine after I met Craig Owens as a fellow graduate student in '76, and through Balanchine's death in '83, I believe, when I went to the ballet all the time. And not only the ballet, but I was seeing Trisha Brown and Twyla Tharp and Lucinda Childs, you know, a very wide range of dance. It was an amateur interest. I loved it, but I didn't have any sense of a professional relation to it. Craig actually did. Craig wrote, you know, his first published piece was on Balanchine's Coppelia, and then he wrote on Trisha Brown's Son of Gone Fishin' and Glacial Decoy. Yeah, but I did not, I didn't develop that sense of, you know, that I might even be able to turn that amateur interest into a more professional one until much later. So I really go back in a way now. If I'm looking at the work of Yvonne Rainer, for example, I've written 2 essays on Rainer's work. I'm going back to work that was being done when I was first in New York that I didn't even have the privilege to see. The earliest work by Rainer that I saw was already in her transition from dance to film. Yeah.
And did you have a sense at that point, you know, of course you're working at the Guggenheim, and so in a kind of curatorial position, but also doing writing. And I wonder if that kind of sense of the worlds that you were operating in was one that also felt kind of totalizing, or if those felt like they were very different parts of your output creatively.
I think they were pretty different. I mean, I didn't, of course I was engaged in, you know, I edited Diane's texts, for example, and I read what she was writing, and I didn't write, I don't remember writing anything professionally for the Guggenheim. I didn't aspire to be a curator. I was more interested in becoming a writer. Working at the Guggenheim was a job, an all-consuming job, I must say. It was, you know, I think it was a museum with heavy ambitions and understaffed, and we did more work than could reasonably be expected of us. We worked around the clock and usually on weekends. So I didn't have a great deal of time for writing, but I thought that I wanted to be a writer. And so as early as 1970, Betsy Baker commissioned me to write an essay for Art News on Georgia O'Keeffe's retrospective at the Whitney. I had no particular interest in O'Keeffe, but I did have a particular interest in writing for Art News. And so I did it, and then I had this humiliating experience, which I talk about in my Art News chapter, of John Ashbery, who was the executive editor, who amused himself by inventing horrible punning titles for our essays. So my Georgia O'Keeffe essay was called "Georgia is a State of Mind." And all of my joy of my first publication was ruined by John Ashbery. So I'm a little unforgiving of John Ashbery in this text, actually. Yeah, so, yeah.
And then, of course, you went on to edit at October. And I wonder if you might just talk a little bit more about that and kind of establishing yourself within that community.
Well, that was later, and it was, I mean, it's the end of the memoir, in a sense. I remember when October was first published in '76, and I remember admiring it very much and thinking, I even say in the memoir, this is the magazine I would like to be associated with. I liked its plainness, I liked its seriousness. I knew Rosalind Krauss very slightly. Very shortly after that, I went back to school to get my PhD. I went to the Graduate Center where Rosalind was teaching. I went explicitly to study with her. By the end of my first year, she invited me to become the managing editor of the journal. And then, of course, I met Annette as well, whose work I had known as a writer for Art Forum, and I had heard her lecture once. Actually.
Annette Michelson.
Annette Michelson,
yeah.
Yes. And, it was a very, very different milieu, but in some ways congenial to me. They were involved with a generation of artists who I admired, but were older than me. So, they published either the writing by or about Hollis Frampton, Yvonne Rainer, and Tricia Brown, Robert Morris, and so forth. I, by then, was doing the picture show. So at the same time, I started in the spring of '77 as a managing editor of October. In the fall of '77, I did the picture show. So I was already immersed in that work. And that was through a different milieu from the October one, which was the milieu around Artist Space in Tribeca, and particularly around the curatorship or the directorship of Helene Weiner. And that was a younger generation. So in a way, the October people were like a little bit older than me, and the people around Artist Space were a little bit younger than me. And so I was, in a way, kind of already negotiating those worlds. At the same time, I must say that I was negotiating very strongly another world, which is the other subject of this book, which is my gay life and my disco dancing years. And I had to kind of give up going out to discos on weekends and taking drugs all the time in order to be a serious graduate student and edit a serious journal. But that presented a certain conflict for me because I wasn't really quite ready to, I mean, I could give up the drugs, but I couldn't give up the dancing and the sex. So, yeah.
Well, they get to, I guess, take different forms slightly.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, but I did have a work routine that was about working until, say, 11 o'clock at night and then going out to bars and dancing. Yeah. Pretty much every night.
And I wonder if you might then talk a little bit more about this kind of section, because one of the things that really strikes me about the book is both the kind of way that it encapsulates a very specific history, that's a very special history of New York, and what happens in New York that I think are many artists who are the predecessors of artists that we're certainly very engaged with today, and kind of look to as the basis for many artistic practices. But the way that you're actually able to do that really kind of combines personal narrative, and I think for me at least a lot of it certainly comes out of this notion that is a well-worn cliche now about the personal being political. But I think what's really special and beautiful for me about the book is the way that those two are imbricated with each other. That the kind of those paths out to dancing in the evening, the folks that you're spending time with there are seen as kind of a full fabric with the kind of artistic engagements, both as a critic and as a curator that you're involved in at that time. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the kind of tensions or the kind of possibilities that you might have seen in it at that moment.
Yeah, it's in a way, it is if there is an overall agenda or subject to the book, it's about putting these two worlds in some kind of proximity and conversation. They were the two worlds that came together in me. They are not worlds that are usually together in a book. So if you're reading about post-Stonewall gay liberation, you'll probably be reading largely about the foundation of various political organizations or community organizations, or possibly the development of a gay sexual culture. Less so that, I think. And that's actually one of the things that I wanted to contribute. So and then on the other hand, you will have, at this point, many books, dissertations, articles, and so on, about the innovations in art in the 1970s in New York. But for those two to come together, you don't find that so much. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason for that, which is actually this, in a way, also the subject of the book, which is that it wasn't so easy to negotiate those worlds in that time. It wasn't so easy to be openly gay in the art world. The art world was not as welcoming to gay people in that period. I write in the introduction to this book, there's a kind of spatial metaphor for this, which is that in 1969, I moved to Chelsea from Spanish Harlem, and I began going every night to Max's Kansas City, which was the art bar on Lower Park Avenue near Union Square. It's the area where Warhol had relocated the factory at that point. And Max's had a long, narrow front room along the bar, and a big square back room that was lit by a beautiful red Dan Flavin sculpture. And the front room was where the artists hung out. The back room was where the drag queens and the Warhol crowd and the Theater of the Ridiculous people hung out. That's where I wanted to be. But in order to get there, I had to walk through the front room, and there I would see and greet, because I knew them slightly at least, people like Lawrence Weiner and Dorothea Rockburn and Robert Smithson and Richard Serra, but I never sat down at their tables. I continued on my trajectory through the bar and to the back room, where I could find Holly Woodlawn and Candy Darling and Joe D'Alessandro and Ondine. These were the queer folks that I wanted to hang out with. And that was always, for me, a kind of difficult situation. I was making a choice. The choice was obvious. And there wasn't much back and forth between these two rooms, except that you had to walk through the front room to get to the back room. That's at least how I remember it. I guess what I'm remembering is the conflict in me. And so that's why I talk about it, because that conflict was everywhere in my life. Mm-hmm. There was, a moment of working on the book where I found the perfect emblem of what I wanted to do in this book, of the bringing together of these two worlds, when I discovered Alvin Baltrop's photographs of gay men cruising in Gordon Matta Clark's work Day's End on Pier 52. Those photographs had been completely unknown, and there are quite a number. There are hundreds of Baltrop photographs, but there are quite a number of them that show gay men using that particular artwork as cruising grounds, sunbathing spot, and so on. Mm-hmm. So those photographs became, for me, a couple of them are published in the book, the kind of, an image of what I wanted to do in my book. And it was it was such a great find for me. I was so thrilled when I found these photographs and was able to publish them, actually, a number of Baltrop's photographs in Art Forum.
And it's also nice to remember that my colleague, our senior curator, Valerie Cassell-Oliver, had organized an exhibition of those photographs in our Zilka gallery downstairs, and you contributed a foreword to that catalog, which was now maybe about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, so there was subsequent to publishing the Baltrop photographs in Art Forum, there have been a number. Lynn Cook and I showed about 35 of them in a big exhibition at the Reina Sofia in Madrid. And I again I and my 3 co-curators showed again about 35 of them. As the first works basically that you encountered in Greater New York, the 2015 iteration of Greater New York. So they've now actually sort of come to notice and and are also finding their way into museum collections and so on. It's a happy ending of a very tragic story of an African American photographer who was not able to show his work in his lifetime, and who died of cancer in 2004.
Yeah, I'm aware that actually our exhibition here was his first museum show ever. I think probably we should open it up to some questions.